Hello everyone, today we talk about defense in the essentials. To the ones of you with longest memory, that's several months long, let's say, at least, I've been reading and commenting roughly 3/4 of the vom Kriege, in fact, in a playlist that reached, I don't know, above the 100 video, that of course nobody watches because, understanding that the whole thing that I do on this channel is of course primarily connected to that is also, just surprisingly my avatar shows it's evidently too difficult to understand, or to understanding that reality requires an enormous effort to be understood than, just chilling out on YouTube and just looking at stuff wherever notifications come out, not doing anything, not just with the channel, but with what one's life is apparently too dramatic to realize and to admit. But we have looked at, this, what von Clausewitz basically calls the strong form of warfare, defense. A key element in von Clausewitz's thought, which is based, as we've seen, on an in-depth reflection on the meaning of defense and on its function in the art of war, to which the entire chapter 6, in fact, of the von Kriege, we still have to finish because that's where we arrived. We almost finished, however. Not surprisingly, the longest of the whole work is. And this chapter is extremely important, as it is underestimated. In fact, so much that in some reduced editions, such as that of Penguin, it is even skipped, which is nothing short but a crime against humanity, and also against the dignity of the minimal human intelligence, for that matter. And recently, as you know, war comes out. I'm really putting some limits to myself, because if I were to digress, I could even easily make a daily video of 2 hours long, to just update about what is happening in Ukraine from a strategic point of view. I follow all this stuff in detail every day. For what we can know, naturally much is unknown also for intelligent political and strategic purpose. But let's say we have to remind, as I was saying in the beginning, that this is primarily a political, in the Clausewitzian sense of the word, channel. Secondly, a strategical one. Only in third rank a historical one, and naturally it's frustrating for me from one side to see that. Of course, I mostly make historical content, but what do I even complain, telling the truth? But these last times have seen naturally on the internet an explosion of the older kind of cliches and misunderstandings, but properly the mishandling of the military reality of war in itself. From one side, I'm kind of satisfied to see that there are people who are still capable of making strategical analysis of some sort. But when it comes to the niche that can also pertain properly to the historical side, and realizing that actually this is taken by some as a sort of, refuge or an escape, an exit from reality, where it also is kind of slammed in our faces so powerfully, like in the last months. Like the thing is, there is no way around this. If you don't understand things like politics or war or society, basically it's useless altogether that you pretend to claim to have any historical interest or understanding in the first place. And if anything, the other way around should be the case. That is to say, the more history you learn, and the more you should understand the aforementioned things. And I could even talk easily about the reaction sometimes that I received at the beginning when I said I supported Ukraine, or I made NATO videos. I mean, the craziest, morally relativistic pirouette just to, not to admit, just to be a narrow-minded person that frankly just followed the channel because they thought I was kind of some sort of ethno-nationalist, or I could be, in favor of Putin, and that, as if the world is either Putin or transgenderism. right? If you reason in those terms, it's because you belong to a fourth estate, culturally underdeveloped reality, that frankly you actually deserve, and with all the consequences of being exploited by people that are more intelligent than you, more educated, more capable, more responsible, and more authoritative than you, of course, but also properly realizing that, again, you can't talk about history, but being able to do really few about the civic, but it's properly the moral and scientific intelligence of an individual, right? And of course this gets back to me in part because it says, but you talk a lot, you make all these videos, and still seemingly you have you give this kind of impression to some of these people that somehow do not understand. Well, of course I'm not entirely responsible for their brain malfunctioning, but let's say I'm not immune either from the responsibility of making more, right? So as you know, in the last years, something less, I've been re-uploading videos, so this thing has changed a bit the rhythm of the channel. That's the reason why I stopped talking from Clausewitz. But I plan, of course, to go back on track, hopefully, and because I realize that that's, again, the most important thing. But as I was saying at the very beginning, when I see that all the videos I make, have hundreds of views, and then, the von Clausewitz ones have like 40 views, if they are lucky, let's say individually, the question is, again, that gives you the measure properly of the missing, of the entirety, of the point missed in the process, and that's a quite painful realization, which I don't think I take responsibility, because I'm basically the only person who's been doing that on YouTube. And again, the fact that I stopped temporarily, but I still kept making videos, this is not an excuse for anybody here to presume that the entire channel is actually a big political and strategical project, fundamentally, that has only secondarily to do with history, if essentially in a instrumental methodological fashion. And again, at some levels I have spoken because I made videos that had kind of a more political nature, and as you know, it's not much that I take a side, because there is not a side, there is just a matter of understanding, right? That's picking sides is necessary, but you pick side with a contingent reality. You don't pick an abstract side that you should always follow because you presume that that's how you can solve your life problems. That's the best way to go straight into disaster, as we have been doing from any side, basically, at this point, macroscopically. And so I frankly don't like that either, right? But again, we have to come back powerfully as the chief. This thing was, even was, the videos were shared, right? And yet another painful realization is that, of course, the algorithm has gone down because of the re-uploads, and that was obvious. But even in terms of the rate growth, you realize most YouTube videos are treated like cheap, immediate consumption among the others, and the deepest, in fact, meaning of the thing is properly not understood. I mean, they don't even get close to. I get it from the comments, right? I know it's a painful thing because I'm kind of saying it's about my own audience in general. There is a hardcore of silent people who just follow and make the thing work, but the other mass floating around, I don't really know whether it's even aware of what's going on in everything, not in the channel, in the world, because it's all about that. And this is a bit of a vent, but talking about defense today, I think it's it's important, because among some of these misconceptions where I started digressing, there is one that is kind of blending. I mean, it's still mixing, confusing the political and military dimension, respectively, that are two conceptually separated things, right? It doesn't matter that they're intertwined in reality, but they're still distinguished, and that's the only way or how you can have a positive approach to reality, if you realize how to use it. In fact, there is a famous quote from Field Marshal Baron Colmar von Goltz in The Nation in Arms, 1883. That sounds something like, those who are on the defensive do not make war, they prolong it. And this is an important concept that we have met in the Outflank, not just actually in relatively to defense, that naturally is basically giving up initiative, right, and having this offensive capacity, but just in the moment in which the enemy fundamentally arrives at you, and all aimed at gaining that advantage, that asymmetry that you deem to be satisfactory to mount up a counterattack, where you think your forces are, in fact, enough to carry that out, or maybe not, right, still resisting at some point, and just that. So naturally, this is dictated by strategical reasons, but political alike, because as we know, as Clausewitz, since war is just a continuation of politics with other means, and it's also an evident thing in general, if you really want to see, if you have eyes to see, and that even for this reason should make you understand why I care so much about the political connection of it all. That doesn't mean we have been so dishabituated to good politics that every time somebody talks politics, it's it sparks malaise, right? And so no, because a good political reasoning is effectively the one that makes things work, right? And that's difficult to get, and politics is always faulty by some degree, like anything human, but this doesn't mean that there shouldn't be properly a realization. And we've seen also in the suspension of the act of war, in the Outflank, how, of course, we're not always fighting. I mean, most war factually is spent not fighting, because combat is just properly an action phase that takes place just in a minority amount of the time, a very circumscribed way, by the way, compared to the complexity and the enormity of the war. So there are these states that are dictated politically, but also respond to the strategic need to objective to attain, militarily wise. So those who are on the defensive, yes, do not make war, just as they do not make war those who are, in fact, stopping, suspending the act of war per se, while, I don't know, they have to resupply, reorganize, whatever. And the deeper idea in the Clausewitzian concept is naturally that defense is not just the strong form of warfare, but it's also the negative one. That is to say, in order to attain a positive object, you're basically you have to go take it, and so therefore you should pass on the offensive. So you cannot fundamentally achieve any of that if you remain just waiting for the enemy to act on you, right, and for you to strike back at that point. So hence the phrase of von der Goltz. But in this sense, it's obvious that defense and attack are I will not repeat myself, or better from Clausewitz, on the laws of reciprocity in war, are dictated by the strategical contingency that may be politically declined in reality, but are also, of course, aimed primarily at winning the war at that point, given that war is, generally speaking, the big deal in any kind of at least in the range of the scales of the resources to invest in it, of that same political picture. So in many ways, when we studied military history, that I also battles or things like this, and that we will talk a bit more strategically and tactically in the soundest way, in the scientific way, that I also relatively stopped talking from some months, because I decided to strengthen again some videos that can go more easily algorithmic, or some basic, more general content, historically speaking. We have seen how generally, there is a broader logic in political and military affairs that is able to adapt. I mean, even in cases of mistake, right? There is always a point, generally speaking, that is maintained logically. I mean, pick even, I don't know, the Russian invasion, how it was waged. Like, there wasn't the mistake there was political primarily. But if you had to ask me how to fix that strategic, was not much. The troops had to be deployed in the same ways. The main problem is that the troops sucked. The moral sucked. Moral forces in general sucked. The whole purpose sucked. Of course, all the organization, the ways, and kind of obsolete ways of war, and dramatic supplies problem. issues that now belong even properly to a doctrine. There's some of you that posed me a question about what's the difference between the NATO and kind of Soviet school doctrine. And we can see even after the 2008 Russian armed forces reform. These are things we could talk about easily, because I study more this than I study the Middle Ages, right? So I care for you to be aware of this, that I'm here talking about history incidentally. And I do, not because I don't study and I don't work with history in my life professionally, but because I don't do it for the sake of let's say, of history as a discipline, as a subject, right? Like the others of you learn school or university, but let's say for those moral and scientific reasons that help me understand war and politics in Clausewitz terms. So that's where the whole cycle closes. So if you're interested, by the way, you just go to the playlist where I discuss the von Krieg, and we talk extensively, properly reading and commenting von Clausewitz that teaches us all these things. But in fact, this is the point. What is defense? That's what we're answering today. What are the aims of those who wage it in war? Now, first of all, obviously the first intention is the defeat of the enemy. This is yet another, it sounds like a banality, but it's really not, right? Because we have this somewhat positivistic idea for which the intention is just, some kind of mechanical process for which, you can hopefully calculate some kind of, sort of effects that do not take in consideration the broader thing. Clausewitzian theory is completely avulse of this, right? It says it's speculation. It's a completely abstract view. What you have to aim at is properly the political goal, right? That, of course, again, is about two people that are fighting a war, and that you have to know what's the mechanism of a war and how to win it. But always remembering that moral forces dominate, and that's basically, in relative terms, the most important aspect of all. So, in defense, the adversary attacks, and if we do not have the necessary strength to do the same, must necessarily be in defense to counter him. You see, this is really not much of an option. As I was saying before, when wars are... I didn't complete the thing, I guess. I was saying, when you study wars, even when you see mistakes that are done, again, you cannot separate them in reality from those broader political moral failures in general. But there is always a military logic that, especially the larger the war and the more evident, the more unescapable in many ways is. That is to say, we do not choose defense or attack just, as we wake up in the morning. It's a contingency based on the struggle that we are waging, and that automatically produces itself. If anything, because humans are individually disposed already for that, and all our political and social systems and our armed forces are structured to that aim. So it's really readily evident and obvious what more or less an armed force should do, right? Then how they do it, of course, is really what counts. As another banality that you may think is, the best strategy is to be as strong as you can. This is what actually the saying von Clausewitz says, because it is really what it gets down to, right? It's not really about the easy trick you can do, at least in your mind, that on the battlefield that outchecks the enemy. It's that single weapon, that other. It's how enormously motivated you are to bring in all you can to make the damn difference, right? And there is never actually the certainty of victory, and therefore not even of defeat. But defense and attack are dictated evidently on the at a strategic level in ways that are connected to that reciprocal relation. Why is defense the strong form of war. We have seen it essentially in the 6th chapter, and defense is just, less difficult to carry out, right? It requires less resources. It provides you a greater, a greater saving before the enemy comes, and that by attacking is also losing more forces in general than you do, right? These concepts are always in general because you can easily have different situations, in fact, based on that kind of moral divide, but especially given that the greater the forces involved, and again, the least option you have, really also the things start to the odds start to level in the same way, and they do, because the more important the thing at stake, and the more the two sides bring things in, and therefore it becomes even just physically a more complex system to keep together, and therefore part also of those disadvantages dilute, right? And so the thing becomes more parity. But this reciprocal action, it also involves, as we were saying before, the positive and the negative objective to attain. In defense, we basically give up the initiative, and we know how detrimental that is from one side, but we know also how detrimental it is for the side of the attack to in fact offend somebody who is well put in defense, and therefore giving up an important part of resources in the process that even there have to be calibrated politically, morally, strategically, and that's why these categories approximate the absolute in theory. Then in reality they have to be calculated every single time. But it's obvious that if I am fighting with somebody, and remember that von Clausewitz always says that war is nothing but a duel on a large scale, it's obvious that, the first thing you want to do is actually go beat the guy down, right? So you should be the attacker. Well, that means having a positive objective. That means that you go there, get the problem solved, right, by that, if you can knock him out. If you don't have that opportunity, of course, you have to defend. And hopefully, thinking that defense is not being passive, in fact, is waiting for the right moment in which, the enemy, by attacking, has that disadvantage that allows you to counter-strike, right? Even just maybe knocking him out of the fight without, going after him at that point, so passing on the offensiveness, but still, right? So this is the logic that we have outlined. And as defenders, our eventual success may be followed by a counterattack or by our acquisition of the initiative to make the victory more complete. That is to say, not just we can counter-strike, but we can, at that point, move on to, offend the enemy in a way that actually forces him on the defense, and, brings us to us to lead the dance, if we can call it in this way. And of course, that is to make victory more complete, and that is, again, not just a strategic point, but also connected to the political one. How far do you want to achieve? To just want to, make the guy away, or you want to literally humiliate it and beat the hell out of him, you want to really kill him, right? It really depends, and you must have all the motivations at that point that are not, and that's why politics is crucial, are not strategically dictated. Because strategically, that is strictly militarily speaking, at that point, the only thing that fight is about is, putting the enemy out of the fight, given a strategic standard. That is, what do you want the guy to do? To leave the place, to leave you in peace, whatever, right? But you may have other plans for that. And the transition from the defensive state to that of the counterattack is particularly delicate and far from obvious. Another aim, let's say, of the defender is saving time. This can be a mean, right? The second aspect is of particular importance because is the defense's ability to gain valuable time necessary for the preparation of offensive operations or to prepare an even more effective defense. The purpose of the military activity will be to slow down, weaken, and eventually guide the opponent towards the most advantageous conditions for our counterattack. So we may have ulterior motives strategically, not just to fence the attack off, but actually gaining time through defense itself for preparing a counteroffensive that is not just a counteroffensive of maybe the strategic elements that we are using actively in the defense. Deterrence also belongs to the defensive purposes oriented to gain time, because in this case the usefulness of the defense is psychological rather than physical. And as you know, war is psychophysical altogether. Actually, the psychological dimension is more important, because at the end of the day, the objective of war, as von Clausewitz tells us, is to compel the enemy to fulfill our will, right? And while the larger the war is, the larger this factually, as war it is by, in general, actually substantiates in the physical annihilation of the enemy. Still, this is easier to carry out when the enemy is exhausted mentally, right? So if you say, I convince the enemy that our current defenses can stop his attack, and in this way we force him to postpone it until the desired asymmetry is reached. So it's obvious that, if you even as an attacker you realize that the enemy defenses are too strong, and you don't have at that point, because these are too complex systems to predict the outcome of a fight between them. Like, so there is never a certainty, right? Just think about the miscalculations that happen all the time. You attack a place, Vic is gonna, they repel you, and you didn't even envisage that, and that naturally comes when you really don't have a pretty good understanding what is going on, which, politically and strategically is not really a good sign of the effectiveness of your at that point of yourself entirely, like as a force. A third aim is to create an economy of forces. This, among the principles of the art of war that we will talk about at some point, is the one that finds its main use in defense. In general, the attack is always more expensive in terms of human lives and material than the defense. So at the point in which one stands in defense, there is a saving of forces that can be profitably employed, where instead one intends to attack, obtaining a useful but not necessary local superiority of forces. And we will see it better in the type, also in the types of defenses, how this is declined. So the defense does give us an advantage in general about the more orderly employment of our forces, that the attacker, when waging the offensive en masse, can loses largely track of, like, it's incredibly energy consuming and therefore chaos inflating moment that in fact is quite dangerous, and that the defense is expecting to exploit to achieve success. And this passes through also this quite accurate, in fact, calculation of how many forces you can think to employ to fence off that attack, given that you are at that point you're having as a defender some advantage that maybe it's not enough, but still in general is over the same amount of forces you would use if you were the attacker in that circumstance. And employment of reserves, we'll see it now. A fourth aim of defense can be conservative reasons, right? For example, the defense of key positions, of the civilian population, of strategic activities. The defensive in these cases becomes necessary, like a strategic constraint that is difficult to circumvent. And you understand there that there are not just strategic needs, there are in fact political ones, fundamentally. And so what you're also fighting for. Another reason is actively or passively shielding the intelligence activity. Preventing the enemy from discovering our activities, our concentrations of forces, requires adequate defensive capacity. You create a screen through which the enemy cannot see. And this is always valid both in the offensive and in the defensive. By the way, we have seen many times, right? Especially in the videos we made, I don't know, in the wars between the Romans and the Persians, the Crusaders and the Turks, how even those who were on the offensive from the, in the latter side, say the Middle Eastern side of typical mounted, say, horse archery combat would do, is that, of course, they would try to harass you constantly, first of all, for unnerving you, but factually screening with those masses of horse archers that individually wouldn't really count much, but altogether could effectively prevent you to get through the approach, for example, of the main force, the really heavy one that had to strike. And some of those armies, we've seen, for example, the Battle of Manzikert, the Imperial army didn't really have much of an idea where the Seljuks were. They hadn't even realized that the entire army had made it from Mesopotamia. It was deployed there. So this idea of properly using troops to defend, even flexibly, like in that case of the horse archers, with hit and run tactics, are let's say, are necessary properly to sometimes to do else, right? To hide else that is maybe in fact properly also an offensive, but still using it as a defense position sometimes. In that case, it's not quite maybe the example, because of course the horse archers would mostly have an offensive capacity. They couldn't defend really, because just missile light troops, right? And they couldn't. So tactically speaking, that's not a good example. But let's say, as long as there was that screen, there was still a defensive potential, strategically speaking, to prevent the enemy from going through, right? And so that is a good example, because it's still defense in the moment in which you can, I don't know, even just shoot a bow at the individual level to keep an enemy away. It's a form of defense. Now, given this variety of objectives that can exist, of course, each one of them at the same time, the doctrine distinguishes three basic types of defensive operations, which, in increasing level of difficulty, are area defense, mobile defense, and retrograde defense. So we'll look at them now as pure categories. So, as we were saying before, every military operation is different. There is no such thing in the physical realm as equality in anywhere, right? By any stretch of the imagination. So every operation must be studied as a thing on its own, that still, however, contains conceptually, theoretically, these principles that are always valid in the same real applicability of the same. And this is what the entire Clausewitzian theory aimed at, a positive application, in fact, of the military instrument actually substantiates itself of, because it does really work. It's not speculation. But of course, usually when we're looking at this defensive operation, we are looking at a combination of them, and it's normal, right? So that's the entire point of the same theory, the same doctrine. The same defensive operation can in fact foresee the three typologies at the same time, even in a plan, or for example, a defined sequence of them according to the circumstances. Now, by area defense, we mean a defense focused on maintaining a certain portion of land for a predetermined time or even indefinitely. It is an imminent passive mission and therefore does not plan to face other enemies other than those who attack the portion of land that is the object of their defense. From one side, it makes the strategic goal easier to visualize, but at the same time it kind of just concentrates on the area, and therefore the surroundings are, left hopefully to somebody else direction. And this is also part, in fact, of some kind of desperate defense, and it's the simplest, in many ways the most effective one, as long as the moral forces, in fact, they are the dominant one, are there. Now, those depend, of course, on other more material side, but if there ain't that at the base of it, that's the superiority of idea over matter. You really can't do much. Conditions that can affect area defense include primarily headquarters assigned missions, such as economy of forces or conservative motivations. Secondly, the area defense can be made necessary by the different mobility between the attacker and the defender. Because if it is to the advantage of the first, any mobile defense is obviously impossible. Finally, the terrain, which can be devoid of channels through which to carry out the counterattacks characteristic of a mobile defense, or deny dangerous maneuvering options to the attacker, and therefore become the most natural choice. To conduct this type of defensive operation, we proceed by studying the terrain with particular attention to derive the maximum intrinsic advantage possible. Because of course you're there basically to win or die. And every fixed defense is based on positions that mutually support each other in depth. And when the conformation of the land does not have sufficient natural protections, it will be necessary to make up for it by building field works. And this is a very demanding activity, naturally, that requires time and hopefully the intervention of the engineer corps, right? And you understand that if you're going to defend that place, no matter what, you need an effective supporting position, and such is also through the internal lines that can support. I don't know, if there is a perimeter within the same, you have to be able to move in a way to support, not to carry out kind of much of combined arms tactics, as you understand, or rather supporting the areas that are more threatened, and knowing that you can move across that area with relative safety. And the same goes for your position, your defensive position that you're gonna assume at the moment of the enemy attack. And therefore, again, time is fundamental to spot where the best combination in position can be, or creating others, etc., and strengthen your position as much as you can, always, right? Never stopping to do more in that sense, even if it takes digging a trench, whatever. It's a very expensive thing. Again, preferably engineer corps are required, but let's say what the first thing about defense in general is never stop reinforcing the defense, never. And exactly because of that advantage, the intrinsic advantage that defense has as the strong, in fact, form of warfare, and therefore the more you capitalize upon it, and the more in relative terms you advantage you're gaining over the enemy. Another aspect of essential importance in area defense is the arrangement and use of reserves. Given the greater mobility of the enemy, the commander will have to foresee, in fact, with foresight, the points where they're mostly likely to be needed in order to facilitate their timely intervention. As I was just saying, this doesn't actually entail a combined arm, tactic in this regard, because unfortunately for the front line forces, the priority, at least use of reserves, is not to reinforce weak points or the ones under pressure, but to be ready in the event of a counterattack, right? So at best you can replenish the first defense line, but the reserve is, as we have seen in the Formkriege, the ace in the hole, as far as you have properly them fresh and readily used when the enemy is already spent, and at that point, if you have to intervene against him, is because the forces that were used against them were taken out. So it's not really the reserve's duty to intervene normally simply in backing the frontline defense, but just to come to the fore when the enemy has, in a sense, already not necessarily overrun it, but in ways that at least it can be profitably spent in order to wipe completely out the enemy once he is spent. And we've seen what enormous advantage in that regard a reserve has, and you understand, in fact, why, for this reason, in defense, this advantage is increased exponentially, because the enemy is the one who is spending himself to move while you're still there, just waiting for him. And so, in general, you are saving more forces in the first place, even just in the fact, outside of the combat. The mobile defense, the second one, as opposed to that of the area, actively aims to destroy the attacking enemy. Normally, it is based on two types of forces: one static, of containment, and one of mobile, of aggression. While the first temporarily blocks the enemy, the second attacks him on the flank, possibly when he is in a crisis of movement, and before he consolidates on the defensive in his turn. Crucial elements of mobile defense are: one, the balance between the forces destined for the two uses, so that each is of sufficient size to carry out their respective tasks; two, the choice of terrain, which must be able to provide both the defensive footing necessary to the fixing position, especially where the enemy has reason to attack, and to be channels of movement for the attack force; three, a mobile advantage of the defender over the attacker; and finally, given that the enemy obviously expects a counterattack, four, the possibility of surprising him as to where, how, and when it will be launched. The mobile defense therefore differentiates itself from the area one, because while the latter basically works of an interdependence of the forces that are meant to be spent just for this passive defense that doesn't contemplate but a counterattack fundamentally, in the areas, if there is any reserve in the areas that have the perimeter defense that has collapsed, let's say, the mobile defense aims at a synergic, in fact, cooperation between a hammer and an anvil, right? This is the easiest one. We have seen it many times. The Macedonian phalanx, for example. The phalanx is basically static, or at least they seem to have fought mostly against each other, especially as such. Of course, they would already advance, but the point was to pin the enemy, the primary one, and to attack it on the flank, on the rear with heavy cavalry, right? And there is no such thing like the Macedonian phalanx without the cavalry. It's a mistake properly to conceive it as such. Also, in the battles of medieval Europe, especially from the 13th century onwards, you have the cavalry lines that clash against each other frontally, one after the other, with this gradual use of reserves, and then there is often this concealed, actually pretty small, and that's where the size of the units also is important, as much as the order, in fact, of a concealed reserve that has to attack the enemy cavalry while is fighting is committed against the enemy battle line, in fact, from the rear or the flank, to cut literally through it and disrupt its cohesion, and to be overwhelmed by these two forces combined. Which, in that case, at least, it's a bit different from a general defense, because cavalry, at least altogether, only attack, right? So, in that sense, we take the defense mostly as, the idea that the two battle lines more or less were on the same place, stopping where they clashed against each other, so they, as defensive, would just counterattack against each other, but the concept is the same. And the point, as we have seen, is to in fact surprise the enemy while he is spending his forces during the attack. That, as we've seen, disorders, fundamentally its formation doesn't say the attack is aimed at breaking a defense, right? So until that is not achieved, the entire fort of the attacker is invested in breaking through, and so that means that it basically cannot defend, or at least even where it can defend on a smaller scale. The wall formation, the wall collective dimension is more important, is however not set for defense, right? And so the idea, of course, is that this can happen in different times. As we've seen, it can happen during the same enemy attack, which can be, at that point, can even reverse the hammer-handle dichotomy, because, maybe at that point, the guy was awaiting frontally, sees that his forces have attacked the enemy laterally while he is attacking you, and so you can't advance in turn. So there can be various combinations. As we were saying, these forces have to be very well calibrated on its side. There is no need to invest more forces, especially when you have the outflanking one that normally moves ahead, and also possibly, in fact, in the range of enemy action. This is the case of reverse, and of the concealed reserve that is also risky out there, is normally smaller in size, and also because the more you get away from your main body, and kind of the more the operations become complicated, also morale kind of decreases, and so at that point you want to really attack the enemy on the flank, but it's not much a matter of genius, right? Wu is able to say, oh, let's use a force on the flank. It was factually, I think, warfare always used. It's just not really publicized in certain circumstances. The point is, do you have forces that can't carry that out? That's the actual strategic logic that you have to find in every battle. And so those outflanking forces most of the times are actually very small, right? And there are major, I don't know, think about the first Battle of the Marne, and the enormous difficulty, logistically speaking, that the Germans had in making that tremendous turn that eventually, the French were provided by all the time to reinforce, and they had also, in fact, shorter supply lines, etc. And so that enormous movement was kind of worthless. It was a bath of blood for just an anvil that was, those divisions in Alsace where not much really happened. So the in comparison to the right wing. So these are kind of good examples of things that naturally can be done. I mean, if you have an enormous force superiority, etc., you can carry that out. The point, as we were saying before, is that normally in war the odds are much more balanced, because the enemy is not simply sitting there to give you battle with an enormous disadvantage. Will move to a better option that he normally has, to the point that he will stop the war if it becomes excessively risky, because that wouldn't counter but the political point, and that's how the entire thing is made. But wars are fought exactly because there is a very often abundant space for both sides to hope to win in their own way. So again, most of the times these forces, the outflanking forces, they have to be quite good. They have to be very well trained, and they have to be also suited to the ground. I mean, a concealed reserve is not an entire battle line, right? You can't conceal it in a forest, whereas a battle line you really can't. So the choice of terrain is also crucial in this, given that terrain is the protagonist in all these aspects. And naturally, there has to be enough properly space of maneuvering. Also, when this thing is not really concealed, etc., or it's based on greater plans or movements. There are some movements that are done in this regard, kind of in more, complex ways, maybe with units passing through corridors between the army. this depends, in fact, on the terrain. There is nothing. But normally, again, the larger the forces, the simpler it gets down in terms of even the main bodies of concentration of forces and the ones that have to outflank. Naturally, again, these forces have, in order to outflank the attacker, must have some mobile advantage. If you don't have much mobility for whichever reason, it can be simply you don't have the vehicles, or you don't have the supplies, or whatever, it becomes complicated to carry that out. And naturally, the enemy is, as any enemy is in history, as much as you should be, is wary of the fact that such counterattacks and outflanking maneuvers can cooperate. So it's difficult to surprise an enemy, especially the larger the forces involved in the battle are, and especially the larger the forces involved, the less the option you have in order to use them in this terrain, which naturally is true again on a larger scale, whereas on a smaller scale, yes, you can achieve more. In fact, normally the tactical outcomes on a smaller scale are normally are more widely ranging in proportion of losses, etc., than the larger ones, and it can help, right? But it's also in there a game of chance. So then we have the retrograde defense that is the most difficult to perform, and therefore it is a task assignable only to specifically trained troops with the highest morale. It consists of an organized combat retreat in the presence of the enemy. Its motives include saving time, which especially making it spend that means to the enemy while attacking is crucial, because the attack is a critical moment, and so the more you make it take, and the more the enemy is maintaining, as we'll see now, in that critical situation, the more is going to be disrupted by it. Maintaining one's own forces, material and human, because you on better defensive lines, you simply want to you realize that the position is untenable, you want to move, and you have to do it by disengaging safely from the enemy. Also, deceiving the enemy and forcing him into an unfavorable position can be a trap, an ambush, to consume his forces by friction, forcing him to continuous clashes as well, and therefore to never abandon the demanding and expensive tactical combat arrangement. Or finally, quite simply, to avoid contact with the enemy or disengage from contact with him, as we were saying. And these are, as you understand, conditions that depend both on the tactical and the strategical situation, that are always deeply intertwined, but can vary in number and or just what's the mandate of that military action in the first place. Now, there are three types of retrograde defense in order of increasing difficulty: retreat, withdrawal, and containment/slowdown. So these differences are important. They can be, as we were saying before, kind of all three at the same time, by different degree, and they kind of always are, right? Because even just historically, what is a feigned flight, right? I don't know. Did the Normans at Hastings, in fact, withdraw, retreat, what, before they counterattacked? Very often it's because they were actually, these forces were actually pushed away. They managed to regroup and to reattack, right? So you're not really playing dolls there. You're killing each other. So these things happen all the time. It's a terrifying situation. And also the attack and counterattack are based on this type of disengagement. So it's really important. So the retreat can be carried out by units that are not in contact with the opponent and must move to a new position. it may happen that there is a pause in the fighting, and it is useful to disengage from the line of fire, perhaps to take a better defensive position, to intervene in another area, to shorten supply lines, or to make up for losses and more. The troops move in combat formation, but the likelihood of being engaged by the enemy is remote, and therefore the movement should be risk-free. The withdrawal, but I understand that in English, I don't know really how in English this is defined, because withdrawal is also, generally speaking, can be maybe is actually the retreat that is used in English in a situation of combat, so not really the one that I just described. I don't know how you say that, but this one we're talking about now is like a pulling back, right? Where, let's say, we distinguish it from the first one, from what we call a retreat, because the enemy is present instead and close, right? But yet does not exert, at least immediately, significant pressure. So the potential danger is, however, greater, right? And therefore it is advisable that the withdrawal is carried out in a coordinated way by units that mutually support each other, alternately moving and stopping in defense. So that there is always, while in the first case you have basically troops moving out and being fairly confident that the enemy is not going to attack them. Again, all these things can be mixed because you may not know what the enemy is, right? In general, like how close it really is, right? So how you distinguish even operationally, it can change things along the way. This other one is instead, okay, the enemy is close. We're even maybe kind of engaging him in some small, but the main body is free to retreat. But still, let's use some units that, while the main body moves out, remains in defense here and there, and kind of withdraws, in fact, from step to step, maybe alternating just to refresh them in the meanwhile, so that we enact that defense locally, so that the main body goes away. And this is interesting, by the way. Also, speaking of retreat, for example, on a battlefield, like when the army begins to not necessarily to rout, but also properly to withdraw from the field, you always find, historically in reality, that there is always a unit that stands its ground and basically gets itself killed very often to allow the rest to flee. Right, in the most desperate situation, this can be, again, an orderly withdrawal. That still may happen. Another can be a rout. This may happen. People will fight to the death. And it's quite common, right? It's difficult not to find an engagement where this doesn't happen. Because, again, in an engagement, it's always going to happen. Even if it were just for one guy that at one moment kind of does it, right? By realizing that it has to stand its ground, even maybe before breaking himself, but still is present and takes form. This is also what the Clausewitz theory and the military experience tells you. Finally, you have the hardest of all, like the containment/slowdown operation, which is necessary when the retrograde movement occurs under the pressure of the enemy. Basically, it consists of a space/time negotiation. Ground is given up by fighting to gain time, and it is performed by slowing down the enemy and turning off the force of inertia, both physically and psychologically, inflicting human and material losses on him without getting stuck in a fight. And you understand that the latter being the most difficult thing to avoid, because if you're under fire, do you turn your back to be exposed? You can't do that, but you risk losses. There are always going to be losses in that sense, and of course this containment slowdown does involve losses in a way, exactly for this reason. In fact, this aspect is the salient feature of any retrograde defense and puts a strain on the training of the troops and the skill of the commander. The enemy will try in every way to block the troops that carry out the retrograde movement. And if he succeeds, the chances of carrying it out successfully become very scarce. And it's kind of obvious. Just imagine, you have to stop this, this enemy from pressing on the main body of your forces. You are left there just to gradually disengage yourself, but trying to slow him down. Right? If you're under fire, taking cover somehow, and the enemy is approaching and getting more troops in, right? Chances are that you're going to remain stuck easily there as the enemy increases that pressure, and so that you will just stay there to to be killed. If you're not skilled, if you're not able to, in fact, move. Also, the terrain here is fundamental, so it's knowledge, right? This is easier to do naturally on a, you know, I don't know, in a urban scenario than in a flat land, because you know, at that point you can easily, you know, from a corner shoot some bullets and then pulling back without being seen easily, and the enemy still has to turn that corner fearing that you're still there, maybe you're already far away. If you're inside, this naturally becomes ever more difficult. And the role of the commander is essential in 4 other aspects in here, because the first one is, let's say, any backward movement can easily turn into chaos if the troops are not coordinated with firmness and intelligence. You just really have to tell them how to alternate in this ballet almost. And 2, the role of the commander is also of central importance to prevent the retreat from demoralizing the troops, as it easily happens in these situations. That is to say, again, the pressure, the enemy pressure increases, and so even just for the strategic reasons that brought you to get out of there, and so to giving up ground to the enemy that may be demoralizing, you have to stay to maintain cold blood and realizing that you're doing that not just to prove anything but just to save time. And so you have to be skilled at it and not really taking this as, you know, we're being pushed back, even if factually is happening by a certain degree. So it's really important to give confidence in this aspect and to feel as if, you know, the enemy was still under your in fact, your moral pressure, as you still dominated in that to that extent that by, you know, keeping the enemy under fire will keep him down while you still have possibility of moving back, right, and pressuring in that sense. And it's difficult when, again, these are just few forces that are trying to hold a greater force that likely has pushed away your entire main body. So it's something overwhelming, and that's why the whole thing is so difficult, and that's the importance of moral forces in the process. You have to hold on. Then an ingenious expedient can allow the troops to gain valuable time. For example, that is one thing, an ambush, you know, a trap, some kind of, you know, mine explodes, something that, you know, makes the enemy freak out, because you have to imagine that the enemy from his side, again, is a critical position because they're attacking and don't want to expose themselves. They're fearful, even if they know that you are few, but still you are defending. So you have that, in general, that advantage that confers to those who are moving, like that degree of lack of, you know, of cover that can be fatal to them. So they are very careful as well, and that's why this form of defense is so still shows the advantage of the strong form of war, right? Another aspect is denying information to the enemy, in particular by deceiving him about the direction of retreat of the main body, right? This can happen at the same time, not just to one of the main body, that naturally is, you know, of greater strategical importance, because you may not know where the enemy is moving away, and that may be a problem for the attacker while he presses on. And secondly, also of the same troops that are performing this containment, because you may be, you know, I don't know, shooting from one side and then taking a completely different direction, completely different turn, maybe gets you even closer to the enemy or passes him by to another side, and so may literally, you know, may serve as a bait, probably to disorient the enemy about your location and your direction of retreat. And we could even also look at some practical examples, but I will leave that for another video. The important was to set these aspects right, because defense is really a crucial aspect of the Clausewitzian theory and of war as a consequence, and therefore must be clearly understood and appreciated in its potential, knowing how to exploit that. For today, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.